Hello, friends, and welcome. My name is Katie Grosh, and I'm the Faith Initiative Coordinator at Grace Farms Foundation. I'm so glad that you're able to be with us this afternoon for a conversation with Steve Engel on the classic text, the Analects of Confucius. This conversation is part of the Books on Faith and Meaning series, oriented around the Faith Initiative's core question, which we think is the treasure of the Faith Initiative. And that question is, what is the shape of flourishing life? As we engage with these different books, we want to ask how these texts can help us make progress in our quest to answer this fundamental question about the shape of flourishing life for ourselves and for our communities. Now, our assumption is that reading is never enough, but at the same time, these texts can nevertheless give us access to people, to histories, and to ideas that, if we allow them to do their work on us, can contribute substantially to our quest. So, before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. First, this webinar meeting is being recorded, so we can share this conversation with a broader audience, in addition to all of you who are here with us live today. And second, if you are with us live, please feel free to use the Q&A function at any point during the discussion. We'll try to get to as many of these questions as possible and speak to them throughout the conversation. So no need to wait to the end to ask your questions, just type them in the chat as they occur to you. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Matthew Crosman, Faith Initiative Director at Grace Farms.
Thanks so much, Katie. As Katie just mentioned, we often say that the great treasure of the Grace Farms Faith Initiative is our question: what is the shape of flourishing life? This question is urgent, it is contemporary, it is future-oriented. That's because it has to do not only with honestly assessing the world as it is, but even more so with imagining the world as it could be, as it ought to be. When we ask about the shape of flourishing life, we ask about what sort of world we ought to seek for ourselves and for young people in our communities. Why then, as we ask this urgent contemporary question, do we so often avail ourselves of ancient traditions and ancient insights? I think in part, we do so precisely because our urgent contemporary questions often come packaged together with hidden assumptions and at times, I think, errors that make our questions seem precisely so intractable. I don't mean to suggest that when we shift to the ancient world, we suddenly escape all of the assumptions or errors, or that our contemporary questions are simple if only we could think them from another perspective. Our questions, I think, are difficult. In many cases, when we avail ourselves of ancient traditions, we discover that our difficult questions have been recognized as difficult for millennia. And our assumptions don't disappear as we look back into history. We carry these assumptions with us. Turning to the ancients for wisdom doesn't take us out of the picture. It merely gives us a different set of interlocutors in the context of whom we might have some chance of seeing ourselves a little bit more clearly. Of course, looking to the ancients brings with it its own sorts of challenges. These texts are distant from us in time and in many cases also in space. It's easy for us to misunderstand if we ignore those distances. Even more, it's possible that we never even get started because these texts seem to us so dusty and distant. And if we never got started, that would be a shame indeed. So today we have both a rich ancient text, the Analects of Confucius, and the perfect guest to help us bridge our distances from it. My friend Stephen Engel is director of the Fries Center for Global Studies, professor of philosophy and Mansfield Freeman Professor of East Asian Studies at Wesleyan University here in Connecticut. He is a writer and researcher specializing on Chinese philosophy, Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, and comparative philosophy. His research focuses on philosophy's role in human rights, politics, and ethics, both in China and globally. In addition to all that, I can say I know that Steve is a master teacher, inviting his students to encounter these texts not merely as historical artifacts, but as sources for enriching our modern lives. So, Steve, I am so glad that you are able to be here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's lovely to be here with you.
Well, I think some on this call will already know, I think I regularly blame you for my newfound love of Confucius. They will, many know you've gotten me hooked. But as I sort of try to encourage folks to pick up the Analects, there is always this sense that that's not the most natural thing to do among the books that one might pick up and read in order to try to I don't know, get some sense of direction on some of the big existential questions that we're all asking, or even just on a smaller level, and practical sources for wisdom to navigate certain challenges in our lives. Analects, probably for many of us in the West, aren't going to lie close to hand or anywhere near the top of the list. In fact, it's easy to feel like these are, as I said in my intro, these are dusty, distant texts. This is a big question, and maybe we'll just spend the rest of the hour sort of spinning out this one question, but I'll start right here. What are, as far as as you see it, what are the most important contributions that the Analects can make to our lives in the contemporary West?
Yeah, well, that's a great and big question, a good place for us to begin for sure. And I think that, when I'm talking about the Analects together with my students, there's two really important two different dimensions that we have to pay attention to. And I think both of these dimensions speak to the way that you frame this really very nicely. So one is we've got to spend some time trying to understand the text in its context. One of my friends from graduate school likes to say that it's important to preserve the strangeness of ancient texts, right? Because if we make them too familiar, then we're going to lose really what's valuable there. If they don't seem different to us, then there's no way that they can push at us. And people lived very different lives 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, no matter where you look. And so we can't neglect that. Those differences can have things to teach us, but also there are ways in which the changes are important and things that we might well want to endorse. So holding on to the strangeness or the distance that the texts have from us is something that we've got to continue to work on. And this gets to issues of how we translate terms. Do we, I'm in general in favor of using gender neutral language when when interpreting the Analects, because I think that there's nothing deep in the text that says, no, this is only speaking to men. But there are a lot of ways in which, in fact, Confucius was speaking to men, right? So that's a tension that hopefully is a creative tension that we can think about. So one whole side of this is the historical contextual side that I don't think any of us can lose track of if we want to take this, wisdom of the ancients seriously. But the other side of it, equally or perhaps more important ultimately, is how it speaks to us today. The goal of encountering a text, whether it's in a sort of a broadly religious context or a philosophical context, is to take it seriously and not just to try to understand it as something in a museum, trying to understand it just in its context period, but rather that relationship to us is of the first importance. And I think it's not hard to get there, even though things do appear sort of at first blush a little dusty and weird. one of the comments that I've always treasured from a student my very first semester teaching. This was not teaching the Analects, this was teaching something perhaps even more obscure, medieval Neo-Confucianism. We had just finished a class talking about the great Neo-Confucian Zhu Xi from the 12th century.
You got me hooked on Zhu Xi too.
Zhu Xi is awesome, absolutely. But I had a student come up to me after class and say, Professor Engel, I just have to tell you that this is the most relevant class that I have taken in college. And I have to confess, my initial reaction was, uh-oh, I hope you don't tell your parents that or whoever's paying your tuition. But we talked about what that meant. And she was somebody who had no formal religious upbringing. This was really the first time that she had been in a position to think systematically about flourishing, about how we live our lives, about how the cosmos is organized and so on with us in it. And, you know, while she wasn't being converted to Confucianism, that wasn't the goal of the class, she was being asked to think seriously about how the frameworks of Confucianism might enable her to think about, for example, conflicts with roommates or issues of environmental justice, whatever was on her mind. Because if we can't use the concepts, right, if we can't deploy them in our context, then we don't really understand them, right? So learning about a text like the Analects, or learning a text like the Analects, is not simply about learning to repeat passages back. It's not simply learning about how concept X relates to concept Y, but it's making them part of our vocabulary so that we can use them, right? So that's the way that these ancient texts, I think, naturally become relevant to us in our lives today.
And I love that thing that you just said, right? You sort of corrected yourself, learning about a text to learning a text. I'll often say to my students, we don't want to just learn about this text. We actually want to try to learn from this text. But I like that just simply learning the text maybe brings both of those, learning about and learning from. Because as you say, if we don't do some learning about, then our learning from is just fiction happening in our own minds, and we're just using the text as a prop. Well, so with that sort of warning in mind, I don't want to spend all of our time, or even most of our time, thinking about ancient history. But I wonder, but as you say, we need to have some sort of understanding. So set the scene for us. What's happening politically? What's happening? Set the scene for the moment of the Analects. How are they sort of appearing on the scene? What are some of Confucius's big concerns? How can we make sense of those in their historical context?
Well, I think broadly speaking, he lives at a time when a pre-existing, fairly stable order and a bunch of assumptions about how society and the world should be organized are beginning to break down. He's not quite at what we call the warring states period that comes shortly after his death, but the sort of central authority of the king of the Zhou dynasty is being challenged. So politically things are unstable, and the moral order, the ritual order that had governed society for some centuries is also beginning to be questioned. He's seeing people who are sort of seeking to pursue their own interests and violating a bunch of assumptions about how people should be relating to one another. And the result this has is leading him to think harder, to articulate more clearly than anyone had before him why that ritual order, why that moral order was important, seeking to justify it in a way that more or less it had just been assumed. So that's why we pay a lot of attention to the Analects and to Confucius, not simply because of the insight that's there, but it really marks an important beginning, if not the only possible way to tell the story, but an important beginning for systematic philosophical reflection in China, right? So it's when you can't take things for granted anymore, that we start wondering, well, is this really the way we should be doing it? And if so, why?
Do you see parallels to our contemporary moment in certain sorts of ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a it's a surprisingly sort of modern moment where there are all sorts of challenges that are besetting society, and Confucius and then students, people who come to occupy different sorts of positions, really begin debating and trying to articulate different visions of flourishing, different visions of society. And at this point, there's not a sort of a deep conflict at the level of ideas. The conflicts that take place are more at the level of politics and straightforward warfare, right? The warring states period that's soon to come is an aptly named moment. There's a lot more sort of sharing and debating and so on and so forth that's going on among the intellectuals over this time period. But then their ideas get taken up by different political leaders and tried out in practice. One of the things that is distinctive of early Chinese philosophy is how ultimately practical it is. It's not just metaphysical speculation, right? It's very much about how should we live our lives on a day-to-day basis, and how should our society be organized, politically, socially, and economically. It's all there mixed together.
Yeah, it does strike us sort of a moment of moment of transition. There are parallels, it strikes me, but even a sort of pluralism, right? A sort of moment where you have multiple different sort of visions, sort of contending alongside one another, sort of to sort of chart the course forward. If we draw those parallels, and maybe we draw those a little bit too swiftly, I don't know, you can help me navigate this, but it's easy then to sort of think of Confucius as a conservative, maybe even as a reactionary. The Zhou dynasty sometimes seems to, in fact, I'll have arguments with theological friends of mine who say, is the Zhou dynasty essentially like the Garden of Eden for Confucius? Is this a sort of almost metaphysical ideal? It's abstracted from whatever it was in material reality. Confucius can sometimes, it can seem like that was, everything was perfect almost. Is that a misreading? I mean, certainly that's some concerns that you'll hear, especially when I teach East Asian students, Chinese students, are often appalled when they hear about how much I love Confucius. Especially often it'll be Asian American students who are very concerned. Oh, you don't quite know how this can go down. They see Confucius as a very, very conservative, even reactionary figure. Is that the right way to think about it? What's right and wrong about that way of seeing him?
Well, I think it's right and it's wrong in different ways. I think having Asian American students concerned about taking Confucius seriously, that's absolutely an experience that I've had and I understand. I think that in many ways it's even stronger for students coming from East Asia, where there absolutely are reactionaries in, let's say, mainland Chinese society who are trying to sort of push various kinds of social progress back and draw on, they claim, draw on Confucianism in order to justify that. So they're able to make those claims, however tenuous I think ultimately they are, partly because there is a conservative element to Confucianism and to Confucius's own approach to the tradition, right? It is very important that for Confucius, there is no sort of source of meaning and value completely outside of the human experienced cosmos to which one can appeal, right? So if one way to be a radical, to say we're doing everything wrong, is to say that I have special access to some kind of meaning and value that y'all don't have access to. We're all, what's going on here is all wrong. And I have this special way of accessing the truth. Confucius does not make that claim. Confucius's access to the truth, such as it is his understanding of the cultural tradition that he and his peers share to varying degrees, and also his insight into human nature, into the way that the cosmos is organized. He talks about heaven periodically, right? But Tian in Chinese. And if you go back several hundred years, this notion of Tian referred to a sky deity, right? So heaven, sky, it's the basic meaning of the word. It's just that stuff up there. It was never up there in the sense of transcending the system entirely. But even so, for the early Zhou people, Tian was a deity, not for Confucius, not for people in his day, several hundred years later. It's more a sense of there's this moral order in the cosmos, and we need to figure out what that is. And one way to do that is to pay a lot of attention to earlier exemplary people, earlier sages who figured a lot of this stuff out, right? And so those sages and their insights that come down, you were talking about the value of ancient books. Confucius too valued ancient books, right? But things that were ancient to him. So we read these texts in part to try to recover what they are, the way that they're speaking to us, right? So that's one lens on this issue of conservatism. But there's one other thing that I want to emphasize, which is that if you look at the details of what Confucius is doing, he is actually quite radical in one very important respect. Many of the categories that he uses are categories that he's taken from the tradition, and that his contemporaries would use also. So the best example is the contrast between the Junzi and Xiaoren. So most commonly translated as gentleman, or if you want to be gender neutral, as I would recommend, we might say exemplary person, right? An exemplary person on the one hand, and a petty person. Now, that contrast, as it comes down to him, is primarily a social contrast, right? The Junzi, or gentleman, exemplary person, literally that means son of a lord, right? So we're talking about an aristocrat here. But for Confucius, a Junzi, an exemplary person, is somebody who is morally worthy, not somebody who is socially lofty. And a petty person is not hoi polloi, not a peasant. A petty person is somebody who is morally unworthy, who has not made much progress on the path towards virtue. And he's very clear that you can have petty people in positions of great social authority, just as you can have lowly people from a social perspective who are really exemplary from a moral one, right? So there's a sense in which that aristocratic order he turns on its head, right? So that's a radical move, but he does so, through the language of the tradition. And what he's claiming is this is actually going back to what the sages' original insights had been.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, and just for sort of help us find a way into that. We can see a similar transition happen in the West, and we can maybe in the transition often it's pointed sort of from Homer to Plato or something like that in the Greek traditions, and we can see that even in our own language, right, where we talk about noble, the two meanings of noble, right? But our democratic values make us want to say being morally noble has nothing to do with being from a noble class. And you're pointing us to Confucius being one of the first in China to make that move. For what it's worth, a little bit before Plato makes that move. But your comments also sort of get me to. I want to get into some of just the real practical. Like I just find Confucius so helpful, and part of it is because these analects are just so pithy, and so you get these just lovely aphorisms, right? And many of them a number of them have to do with reputation, which trades on exactly this question, right? If you have a noble station, does that mean you have noble character? Or if you have noble character, does that mean you're going to end up with a noble station? And it seems that many of Confucius's interlocutors, his students, seem to be very concerned about this. And so he will give them little pieces of advice, like in 4:14, do not worry if you are without a position. Worry lest you do not deserve a position. Do not worry if you are not famous. Worry lest you do not deserve to be famous. And it strikes me that in a social media moment where, various surveys of young people, have found that, I remember one, it's probably a bit dated now, but in the 70s, you would survey American young people, and what would you rather? Would you rather have sex or be famous? And sex ranked much higher. It flips sometime by like the 90s or the early 2000s. Much more interest in being famous than in sex or relationships or whatnot. So anyway, as we seem to be more and more obsessed with fame, I find these sorts of teachings just immediately sort of relevant. What should we make of this? What should we learn fundamentally from Confucius about our concerns with reputation?
Yeah. Well, I think that the superficiality of a unearned reputation, I think, is the central thing that he's concerned with, because Confucius is not a hermit. He is not somebody who's just interested in sitting somewhere, meditating and becoming wise, disconnected from society, for better and for worse. And it's for worse to the degree that it can be a difficult task. He sees himself as, like all of us, unavoidably connected with human society and with responsibilities to others. And that means that there is a sense in which one's genuinely earned reputation matters, right? The Confucian model of governance is one that ultimately rests on leaders who are role models, leaders who are exemplary and influence us. So you cited a passage, I'll shoot back 2:1, which, let's see here, in this translation reads, the master said, one who rules through the power of virtue is analogous to the pole star. It simply remains in its place and receives the homage of the myriad lesser stars, right? So a ruler or a leader in any context here is someone who, through the power of their example, is having this positive influence on everybody else within their ambit, right? Such that it seems to be natural in the ways that stars orbit around, right? So the key is coming to earn that reputation, to earn the name, right? So this notion of name or reputation is so subtle ultimately in the Analects, because just as you say, if what we're aiming for is the name, then we've gone about it the wrong way. But if what we do doesn't ultimately earn us the kind of influence through reputation on others and through personal example on others, then we've also failed.
It seems to me he has a sort of a third case or another maybe axis of concern here, which is he'll say in a country governed by the way, or so it's a sort of question of I'll try to stop short of just asking you, Steve, what is the way? What is the Tao? But some sort of sense, like when things are governed appropriately, I think of it as sort of, again, I probably got all of this from you, but it's sort of like maybe it's tumblers in a lock, sort of like coming into right sort of alignment, and the world is sort of as it ought to be in some sort of in most important respects. So if a country's governed by the way, well, then you should expect that those who deserve a good reputation will get it. in a country not governed by the way, you should not expect that correspondence. And that seems to me another sort of really wise sort of insight here. Often we'll tell my students, don't just we are very inclined, us moderns, to be concerned about not, and it seems like us humans, to not have the good reputation we feel or the fame we feel we ought to have. But we probably don't worry nearly enough that maybe we have good reputations within broken sorts of systems in which having that kind of reputation is itself sort of suspect. Am I reading that right? How should we think about this sort of like in a world sort of land governed by the way versus one that has lost the way?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that's really perceptive. The contrast that he talks about is what should one do in a society governed by the way, in a world governed, or in a world where the way is being realized, right? So it's not like the way is something that we can see quite directly and is governing us. But when we have seen the way, when in particular people in leadership positions have understood and internalized the way, then just as you say, things fall into place. Harmony is one of the ultimate Confucian ideals. Harmony in which things just fit together. Harmony is the combination of complementary differences that we see in a wonderful piece of music, in a wonderful, soup is an example, is an ancient Chinese example where all the different ingredients complement one another, and so on. So that harmony is what we're trying to achieve. But disharmony is all around us, right? And so the question is, in a world that is not following the way, what do we do? And there is definitely a strong activist sort of thread running throughout the Analects, where we have a responsibility. Confucius is showing you through his example what it means to have a responsibility to try to nudge the world in the direction of actually following the way. But there are passages where, if in a given state, the ruler is so terrible, completely not following the way, does that mean that you have to go there and you have to, fight against that, stand up, speak truth to power, and so on and so forth, at the risk of your life? Well, not necessarily. I think there's no kind of complete timeout. Just again, go off to the cave somewhere. But the ways in which we shoulder our responsibilities for the way, I think, can vary a lot. I think last summer, my friend and colleague Joseph Chan, who teaches in Hong Kong, wrote a piece in a Hong Kong newspaper about what it is one's supposed to do when the way does not prevail. Right, and so very poignant to think about this in the context of contemporary Hong Kong. And he was very much arguing that you never get a free pass, no matter how bad things are. The ways to resist, the ways in which to try to, as I said, nudge things gradually in a better direction, may be more indirect and more subtle. This is not a philosophy demanding self-sacrifice, but equally, you never reach a point where, okay, I've done enough, I'm good. It's always asking us to keep trying, as Confucius himself does, right?
Yeah. Another huge thing and theme that is, and maybe the first thing that would come to many people's minds if we have accurate impressions of Confucius, any sort of impressions of Confucius to draw on, would be the theme of family. And so, in 1-2, we have a saying attributed to Master Yu, but a man who respects his parents and his elders would hardly be inclined to defy his superiors. A man who is not inclined to defy his superiors will never foment a rebellion. A gentleman, junzi, works at the root. Once the root is secured, the way unfolds. To respect parents and elders is the root of humanity. Understand that's the word ren. Really important ethical concept. How this gets sometimes lumped together under the heading of something like filial piety, and sort of central role of filial piety in Confucian thought. And it's a strong statement, right? The root of humanity, of humaneness, or something like that, is this respect of parents and elders. How should we understand that? Are there insights that might be one of those things that sounds really conservative and maybe dangerous? How can what insights can we glean here?
Right. So this is a great pivot, but we can also connect it up with the question that William raised in the Q&A just now. So he's wondering about civil disobedience and a little bit more about how one can push back. So I think we've got here, is it what's the passage number? 418, no, that's not the one I want. Oh yeah, 418 in the Analects. So the master said, in serving your parents, you may gently remonstrate with them. However, once it becomes apparent that they've not taken your criticism to heart, you should be respectful and not oppose them and follow their lead diligently without resentment. So the relationship between oneself and others is absolutely central, at the center of Confucianism. And these relationships are understood often to be hierarchical. That is, there is a sense in which one looks up to one's parents, one looks up to leaders, and so on. Or if and the reciprocal aspect of that relationship is true at the same time, that in looking down, as it were, one has certain sorts of responsibilities. Right? So, so in the context of any of these relationships, and I'm going to come back to the filial piety as a root, but in the context of any of these relationships, we have responsibilities to one another, and ultimately to the largest community, ultimately to the cosmos. Ultimately, we have responsibilities to realize the way. And so what do you do when things are going awry? In the context of a political leader who is not following the way, I think that something like civil disobedience is eminently appropriate. So gentle, I guess, remonstrance is how we pronounce that word, with respect to parents. Again, circle back to that in a moment. Civil disobedience in an extreme case, right, where protest, peaceful protest, is maybe not enough, and so you need to actually break the law, but to do so in a way where you're making a communicative action. You are saying there's something wrong with this system, and that's what I'm expressing by breaking the law. Go ahead and arrest me. That's the whole point, right? Is to show the way in which the system is problematic. So I think that Confucians have shown great courage over the millennia at speaking up. But they tend to do so in a mode that is not violent. Sometimes they are treated with violence. Sometimes the response they get is violent. But I think that Confucians, as I say, for many centuries, have anticipated some of the ideas of peaceful resistance that have been so influential in the 20th century and the 21st century. So that's, so civil disobedience and this kind of resistance is more than one would hope one has to engage in with respect to one's parents. But even with parents, ideal is that we're all following the way. And so when parents are not, you try. But the loving relationship with your parents is still so central to the Confucian conception of a proper world order, that if the gentle remonstrance doesn't work today, well, then the advice is to sort of take a step back, to go along with them, maybe try again tomorrow. Through your own example, try to help them to learn. But why is this so important then? Why is filial piety ultimately so central? So it is in one's relationship to parents that one sort of first begins to learn about the world as a place where people care for one another. And you know, your parents, at least in most cases, in favorable cases, and when parents are deeply problematic, there's, you know, Confucians talk about that too, right? But it's in that relationship to parents, and then more broadly in one's family, that one first begins to learn about the importance of relationships of care, relationships where you are growing through what you give to others, because that's what your parents are doing to you. And so it's both a starting point for moral growth, coming to think of oneself as a sort of a nexus in a field of relationships, where your growth depends on how all of those others do. So it's a starting point, but then it's also a microcosm of the whole thing, right? That relationship that you are supposed to are able to begin to cultivate in the context of a family is a model for the relationship you should have to the rest of the cosmos.
That's really powerful, and that sort of, yeah, we're a node in a network of relationships. This sort of relational ontology, even sort of thinking about that maybe primarily, the relationships are primary, and our self sort of emerges from at that nexus, yeah, of relationships is powerful. You do have these, as you say, the ultimate horizon here seems to be universal, but it's not universal without respect to locatedness, which I think is actually one of the things that I've found so helpful about Confucius's thought, is that in many respects, it seems to me that as a modern Westerner, when I try to think about how to be moral, I try to forget myself, right? I try to, I mean, you can find the philosophical sources for this probably among the utilitarians, but I try to imagine myself nowhere. And in forgetting myself, then I'm able to maybe try to think morally, think without bias. It strikes me that Confucius thinks very differently, and yet still has a way of thinking about universal responsibilities. But the text that brings me up short, and yet I think has become for me a text that offers a window into this very different sort of way to manage universal responsibility, think about moral responsibility, is in Analects 13:18. Get a little pithy little story. The governor comes to Confucius and says, "Among my people, there is a man of unbending integrity. When his father stole a sheep, he denounced him." That's a sort of, I recognize that. That sounds good. That's moral, right? Anybody stole a sheep, you denounce them, and just because it's your father, why would anything change? So I get that this governor holds this up as a moral ideal. Confucius says, "Among my people, men of integrity do things differently. A father covers up for his son. A son covers up for his father. And there is integrity in what they do." So in part, I guess I just invite you to explain for us, Professor Angle, what this concept of integrity is. And I suppose some of the way that I've ended up wrestling with this is as asking the question, is integrity, is justice even maybe a matter of impartiality? Or is it a matter of being rightly partial? Is that the right way? Is Confucius trying to make some room maybe for that second piece? Help. I found this text to be so fruitful, and precisely in a way that I never feel like I've quite landed. So I would love to hear sort of how you lead me through it.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Matt. Let's start with the way you started this this thread, which was with the idea that in order to be moral, what one might do is try to sort of forget oneself and to be, as it were, selfless, right? So the ideal of selflessness is something that I'm sure everybody is familiar with. Selflessness is not a Confucian ideal. Instead, the idea is to expand the self, right? So the self is not the problem. The self is the source of our ability to grow as moral beings. And that sense of growth over time, and then growth, in terms of the scope of our concerns and our relationships, that's what we need to attend to. So someone who's on the path, and it's always a path, it's always something that's in process, as we're expanding ourselves, attending to more and more difference in their interesting particularity, thinking about how they relate to us, right? Someone who's gone a fair way down that path is going to be acting with great concern for others, right? So there's a sense in which you might say a selfless person and an expanded self person might often end up doing similar things, right? But for pretty importantly different reasons. And you might well imagine that the selfless person is going to think it appropriate to really not have much to do with his or her family or children, because they're off volunteering, they're off, so on and so forth. And so that's where the Confucians and the selfless utilitarians are really going to part company with one another, because those things that are at the core of oneself, one's relationships to intimates, one's relationships to family and local community, can never be dropped away in the way that the selfless model might suggest. So I think that the sheep stealing incident, right, is meant to be provocative in just this way. It's meant to call attention to the fact that you can't just treat, under no circumstances or no realistic circumstances, can you treat your father just as you would treat some other person. And you see a random stranger stealing a sheep, well, call it in. Your father steals a sheep, you have a different set of responsibilities here. And it's important that Confucius doesn't say, yep, cover it up, end of story, right? And there's some wonderful sort of speculative extensions that different thinkers have engaged in historically and today about, well, what's really the whole story? How did your father end up stealing the sheep, and what comes next, right? Trying to provide some more context, drawing on other sorts of Confucian values. But clearly this is a teaching moment, right? And how you do that exactly? Well, I mentioned gentle remonstrance already. There are some constraints, but in a case of a pretty major wrong, as we can imagine sheep stealing was then, and maybe would be thought of today, right? It's not just enough to say, Dad, that maybe wasn't the best idea, and then leave it there, right? There's a significant rupture that's been created in this sort of harmony of the local social fabric here. So, how to spin out the story from here depends a little bit on, well, who'd you steal it from, and what's the whole situation, why'd you steal it, et cetera. But until harmony has been recovered, and really until, again, long path, until your father has undergone enough moral growth of his own, such that he's not tempted to do that anymore. It's not just that he doesn't do it anymore, or he makes restitution. Actually, the goal is much more than that, right? So filial piety isn't just doing what your parents say. It's having this relationship of love and respect for them, for sure. But part of that is precisely thinking of them as also capable of growth on their of their own, right? They're also people on a path towards virtue.
That's really helpful. And in your last comments there, remind me of this dynamic. I may not have time to get into it, but just to point folks for further reading, 620. To know something is not as good as loving it. To love something is not as good as rejoicing in it. Or even sort of classic text in chapter 2, 2:4. Confucius gives his own sort of history of moral growth. The last stage is, at 70, I follow all the desires of my heart without breaking any rule. The goal ultimately is some transformation of the self, such that living in harmony, following the way, this is natural, desirable, and even a source of joy.
Yeah, I think it's it's worth maybe dwelling on that for a moment here, because I've been saying, there's this path that we're all on. We each can be better tomorrow than we are today, and that's what the process of learning that the Confucians want us to undertake, right? That passage 2:4 begins by saying, right, that Confucius commits himself to learning at the age of 15. So if you're a high school teacher, take that to be about high school. If you're a middle school teacher, well, might as well be about middle school. College, it doesn't matter, but there is this commitment, sort of taking it seriously. Let's make learning an explicit project and not just what we're taking in through osmosis. And understanding that learning here is what we might call today, teaching to the whole person. It's a holistic kind of education. It's not just learning about facts and figures and so on. It's not just a technical education. And so, in a way, the liberal arts that we still treasure today fits in pretty well. They tend to get instrumentalized too much and so on. But that notion that we're trying to learn to be better people, and it goes on throughout our lives, right? That's what this is all about. And the idea of a sage, Confucius is 70, able to spontaneously do the right thing and take joy in it. That's supposed to be a realistic ideal. Realistic, at least in the sense that we humans can, in principle, achieve that. So this is not leaving the world behind. It's not Plato's vision of, a philosopher is living towards death, because only when you lose your body can your soul have perfect knowledge. Right? It's very much a vision of real embodied people living joyful lives, or at least getting as close to that as we're able.
Steve, this has been really, really helpful. I wonder if I could ask you this as a sort of last question. I might have we'll see. But what I really respect most about you is I know that this is not just talk for you. This is about your own life and the way you want to live your life. So I would just love if you'd be willing to share a little bit. How have the Analects most shaped your life? And maybe as part of that, how have they shaped your hopes for your children?
So I think that for me, it's been a long and gradual process of coming to realize that the thing that I was studying was something that had been subtly shaping me, for sure, but also increasingly I saw it as something that was articulating values that I held, in a way of doing so kind of wholeheartedly. So I, for many, many years, have identified as an atheist insofar as that, the set of categories around theism come up. My wife is Jewish, and we have raised our children as Jews, and they've been had wonderful bat mitzvahs and so on and so forth. And so on pretty regular occasion, I've attended services at our synagogue. And there's a lot that I love about it. And there are other things where I'm not wholeheartedly there. In fact, I found that I prefer the prayers in Hebrew to the ones in English because I don't know Hebrew. And so I am not saying things consciously that I believe to be false about God being great or what have you, right? But I think that the ritual, the community, the focus on morality, the whole, just the institution of the sermon, which obviously is not unique to Judaism, right? We don't have, it's really hard to find things like that outside of an organized religious setting. And all of those things I think are wonderfully valuable. And so it's often been sitting in temple that I'm reflecting on Confucianism and the ways in which the importance of ritual, not just grand ritual in a service like this, but day to day, moment by moment rituals that inform how we interact with one another. Those are so important, and I think the Confucians help us to understand why. The sort of awe that we feel, with respect to the majesty of the cosmos. That's language that I can get behind. That's the way that Confucians tend to talk about our place in the world. So there's just been this gradual process of coming to feel a fit, feel a home with Confucianism. And one thing I'll just leave the audience wanting more. One thing we haven't talked about at all, which for me has been quite important, especially in recent years, is the deep insight I think that Confucians have into death and mourning. Right, one of the central rituals they talk about is the funeral. And when I lost my father a few years ago, that was my first time I really had intensely experienced what they were talking about. And for Confucians, we talked about their metaphysics and so on, or lack thereof. Death is not about the person who died. Death is about everybody else. And the sort of the violence of the rupture of relationships that it causes for the rest of us, and how we deal with that, how we work through that. And so I think there's just a great deal of insight that the tradition offers throughout the life cycle to many of us.
Steve, thank you so much for those reflections. And I don't want to, we're not ready to announce anything, but I know you're working on a book that'll be coming out early next year. And I imagine you'll have some things to say on precisely those topics. So maybe we can make sure that we talk about mourning and with that new book that's coming. We're at time, but I'll ask you one last question, which is if people want to jump right in, I've been reading from this Simon Lay's translation. I know that that you like some other translations. What translation should folks run out and go get that maybe will give them a good text to read and some historical helps along the way?
So if the goal is to have a text that you can really kind of sit with and reflect on passage by passage, which is a good way to encounter the Analects. It's not a terribly long text. Then the one that I really like is a relatively new one. So the translator's last name is Ni, N-I, first name Peimin Ni. So the title is Understanding the Analects of Confucius. And it's a pretty big book, but don't let that dissuade you. Again, the text isn't really all that long, but he does a wonderful job of providing translations that are usefully ambiguous where the original is ambiguous, and then providing commentaries, both his own and drawing on, centuries of commentaries that helps you kind of think about the different things that this might mean and the different ways it can connect. And one of Professor Ni's real insights, he talks about his approach to the Analects as a gongfu approach, like kung fu approach. That is a practice. It's about embodiment and lived encounters with the text. So I think it really resonates with the ways that I've been talking about the Analects today.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again. Look forward to future conversations, and thank you for being here with us today. And for everyone who joined us today, thank you for being here, and look forward to welcoming you back to another Books on Faith and Meaning next month with poet Tim Lilburn with his prose book, Living in the World as If It Were Home. Some reflections on what it means to live in the natural world as part of it. So, thank you, Steve. Thanks, all.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye.